Hello and welcome back. So we're talking in this video about training camp holdouts, and we're doing that for a reason and wondering, does it affect production after the fact? So yesterday I saw in the headlines that Jason Robertson isn't likely to show up at training camp without a contract, which could potentially have implications for fantasy, as he is one of the top left wingers in the league, currently going at ADP 48.5 in the 4th round. If you haven't checked them out already, I went over his file in the Left Wing Goal Scorers video, as well as in a YouTube short fantasy file feature. But this likely impacts his ADP. But the question I wanted to get today was whether or not holding out, mainly contract holdouts, impacts production that season. And if that's the case, then you would maybe not want to draft Jason Robertson this year, but if that isn't the case and his ADP drops, you could find some value there. So let's take a look at some of the guys who've done this type of thing in the past. Now, Brady Tkachuk, there was a couple of holdouts last year. A lot of them, most of these guys are going to be RFAs, and that's one of the big reasons why they hold out, because they don't have a ton of leverage. And Brady Tkachuk was one of those cases. That was back in 2021. It seemed like a rite of passage for a Tkachuk to hold out or exercise their rights to earn money that they feel they deserve, or to play wherever they want to play, as we just saw this past season. So Brady Tkachuk held out during training camp. He ended up missing 3 regular season games as a result. And then he did secure his bag and has since been given the captaincy, so all appears to be well. But how did it impact his production that season? So as we look into the numbers, it actually gave him quite a boost. As you can see here, the per game production went up by 0.2 points per game. The goal production was much higher, and the totals across the board are better. He did end up with a -7, likely as a result of the team defense. But other than that, he bet on himself and he got his money, and then rewarded the Senators for placing their trust in him. He didn't even start that slow to start the season either. He had 3 goals, 2 assists in his first 10 games after coming back. So if this is any indication, the idea that missing camp may hurt a player like Robertson isn't holding up thus far. But let's take a look at some of the other examples of the RFAs from that season. Elias Pettersson. For Pettersson, his total season production, like Tkachuk's, seems to tick up after holding out in camp last year. So it's worth mentioning that he and his teammate Quinn Hughes didn't miss any regular season games because of this. They signed during camp. But his point per game average did increase slightly, and if you look at the full year totals, that would indicate that holding out has no effect on him either. But if you dig a little bit deeper into his file, you do see one other major factor that skews this data a little bit, and that would be Bruce Boudreau. So Pettersson scored 56 points in 55 games after the coaching change. That was a 1.01 point per game average. While before the coaching change, he had 12 points in 25 games, essentially half as productive at a 0.48 point per game average. So just looking at the data, I would, more likely, I would say that coaching in this particular case had more of an impact on the production. There may have been a slight slowdown at the beginning of the season for Pettersson, just missing training camp. And then he clearly made up for that in the second half. So that could be a way to play this as well. If you start to see Jason Robertson start the season slow in the first month or two, they did have a coaching change already in the offseason, so they're not likely to have another one. But that could be, one of the things to keep in mind is that Pettersson turned it on in the second half, so maybe Robertson would as well. But let's check out Pettersson's teammate, Quinn Hughes. So alongside Pettersson, Quinn Hughes held out at the same time. Both were likely a product of limited cap space that Vancouver had, less than Hughes was holding out for more money. So as you'll remember, that was the year that Seth Jones signed for $9.5 million AAV times 8 years. Werenski signed a 6-year deal with an AAV of 9.58. Nurse signed an 8-year deal, $9.25 million, and Makar signed for 6 times 9. So the defensemen that are most comparable to Hughes were getting paid north of $9 million per season, and Hughes ended up signing for 6 years times $7.85 million, which was a little bit of an underpayment compared to his peers. So just like Pettersson, Hughes didn't miss any games. He signed for less than market value, which may factor into his increase in production after the holdout. But unlike Pettersson, he got off to a hot start with 2 goals, 10 assists, 12 points in his first 12 games before cooling off a little bit. They then both ended up with identical point totals at 68 points at the end of the season. And Hughes improved his defensive game as well, going from a -24 in 2021 to a +10 in 21-22. So thus far, it appears as though people that don't show up to training camp, they're holding out for a contract, are actually performing better than their previous season and are potentially more motivated to justify the time that they missed. Now, we talked about Brady Tkachuk a little bit earlier. Let's talk about Matthew Tkachuk because he did something somewhat similar several years back. So this was 2019. And in 2019, Matthew Tkachuk, quote unquote, held out. And I say that tongue in cheek because he did get some time in training camp. He didn't miss the whole camp. But he did sign after there had been some preseason games played, and there was some concern that he wouldn't sign. So that was the growing frustration in Calgary at that time, is that he was still holding out, and he was one of their most prized assets. So he did miss some of camp. He gets a deal done. He started off hot with 2 goals, 4 assists, and 6 points in his first 5 games of the year. So nothing there to indicate that impacted him. And he may have even been considered a moneybags candidate at the time, considering his contract was the highest in Flames history at the time it was signed. But that didn't impact him at all either. There was a slight dip in production, so we'll note that and continue with the analysis. But thus far, we have 3 examples of players not being overly negatively impacted by holding out during training camp. As you can see here, his production dipped from 0.96 to 0.88 points per game average. Nothing crazy, though. His goal totals were a little bit further down, 11 fewer goals, a couple fewer assists. But all in all, this was the year that things got cut short due to COVID, so that's why he only had 69 games played. But still, he was relatively productive despite having a slight down year. Now, another guy that held out a couple of years ago, this was 2019, Patrik Laine. Now, he was another one of those RFAs looking for a contract. He ended up, going with the bridge deal route, just like Tkachuk. His bridge deal was a 2-year, 6.75 AAV contract, and he was ultimately traded the following year to Columbus. And we won't go too much into that debacle for the Jets. But what did happen was a major breakout in production from Laine following that contract being signed. So if you look at the numbers here, his production jumped by 0.32 point per game. And, that it didn't really change his goal production. His goal production was pretty consistent there, 30 goals the year before, 28 the next year in fewer games. But his assist totals improved from 20 assists in 18-19 to 35 assists in 19-20. So he did a little bit more than what he's usually used to doing. And then on top of that, this was the year, and I mentioned this in a previous video, where for whatever reason, he felt more engaged and he was throwing the body around. He had 1.42 hits per game, which is more than double most any other year that he's played in the league. So he was definitely more engaged and motivated to perform following the contract and the holdout that cost him the first week or so of training camp, though he did get some training camp time in. And he didn't miss any regular season games either. So looking at both Tkachuk's, Hughes, and Pettersson, we see either a negligible drop in production in terms of Matthew Tkachuk, a slight uptick in production for Pettersson, or a very healthy increase in production for Brady Tkachuk, Quinn Hughes, and especially here, Patrik Laine. But now let's look at what happens when a player misses significant regular season time due to a contract dispute. So not just training camp, but they actually miss a ton of regular season time. And this is the quintessential case for this exact type of thing. William Nylander, 2018, that saga went literally down to the wire 2 minutes before the RFA signing deadline on December 1st. All of that noise and distraction, he missed 28 games. He eventually ended up signing a 6.97 AAV deal, and here's the little catch on that. So he signed for 6.97 AAV, but he got a $2 million signing bonus on December 1st when it was signed. He got $10 million AAV that season in terms of not his cap hit, but his actual money. And then he got an $8.3 million signing bonus the next year on July 1st. So essentially, Nylander sat out 28 games and got himself over $20 million over the course of the next calendar year. So that could definitely indicate a moneybags phenomenon for sure, especially since he missed some time and missed, a good chunk of the season. And what happened with his production? Well, it fell off a cliff. So 0.74 point per game average the season before, down to 0.5. Obviously, the games played numbers are down, the goal numbers, assists, points, everything across the board was a lot lower. And that was a constant thing at that time, was wondering if this was going to impact his production, and it certainly did as you went through the course of that season. Now, every year since then, he's exceeded even his 17-18 numbers. So he's been above a 0.8 point per game player. He's even been above 0.9 most recently. And he has proven to be good value at that AAV, but that one season, because of the distraction and the time away from the team, missing 28 games, everything that went into it, it did result in a large decrease in production. So that is one of those cases where you notice a player holding out for more money, missing time, missing camp, and then as that drags into the regular season, the production is very difficult because he's starting when everybody else has already had 2 months of play, and he's starting flat-footed. So he did not have a chance to catch up after all of that. So just to summarize all of this, what does this mean for Jason Robertson? What does this mean for other players that are likely going to go through this in the future? So particularly with Robertson, if he misses training camp due to a contract dispute, it likely won't affect his performance. In fact, it may boost his performance, as we saw with most of these case studies. But if, however, Robertson starts missing games, then he could be a candidate for regression. But the sample size on that is very limited. As we just saw, there was only one of those players that we looked at that had a regression that was notable. And it would be impossible to know that heading into your fantasy drafts. So what would be the takeaway? What's the play here? The takeaway is don't pass on Robertson just because of this factor. Don't pass on players going through this phenomenon in the future. Just monitor their ADP. And if you can get them at an even and potentially even more productive version of that player at a potentially lower ADP because of all the noise surrounding missing camp, that would likely add more value to that player and that pick, likely in this case to be in the 4th or 5th round. So don't necessarily stay away from him. He would be the type of player where if you drafted him and you got a good value for him, maybe monitor his first couple weeks. If he's starting slow, probably don't give up on him, just because we saw the second half production with a guy like Pettersson. That did factor in a coaching change, but at the same time, a lot of these guys, when they came back, they didn't necessarily start slow. So if he does start slow, you may think about getting rid of him, but I don't necessarily see that to be the case, as we saw most of these case files were overproducing their previous season and their totals from the previous season, which would be quite incredible for Jason Robertson, who was a 40-goal scorer last year. So if you're looking to target Robertson, keep all of this in mind. But as we saw here, it's not necessarily going to negatively impact his performance this year. So just a quick little video. Just wanted to do a little case study, something that was newsworthy and potentially going to impact your fantasy drafts as we go forward. But I want to thank you all again for paying attention until the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.